And hello, welcome to the second lecture on the Civil Rights Movement, and this one is going to focus on the Civil Rights Movement in the North. And we sort of have a thesis going ahead that the Civil Rights Movement can be divided into two periods, and the first one was the one of tackling Jim Crow and using nonviolent civil disobedience, economic pressures, and others, and was largely successful. The second one was centered in the African American communities in the northern and western cities, and different goals, and due to the war in Vietnam and just over the lack of broad political support and white support, its goals remain largely unmet. And we need to keep in mind the context of in the North here, that 64 to 68, we have the Civil Rights Act being passed, a hallmark of the Civil Rights Movement. Same year they get involved in Vietnam in a real way with the Gulf of Tonkin incident. And the next 4 years are going to be ones of increasing violence and militancy, both within the country, in the Civil Rights Movement, and in Vietnam. And in 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated, and we have the big turning point in the Vietnam War that convinces the American people that they cannot win that war. 1964 to 1968 is a very rough period in American history. And it's during this time that there are a number of riots within the African American urban communities. Now, the blue ones here are showing the riots that occurred after the assassination of Martin Luther King in 1968, but other ones were occurring earlier, say in 65, 66, 67, and for many whites, they're quite confused. You know, if we're having success in the Civil Rights Movement, we support it, and we're getting the Civil Rights Act passed, the Voting Rights Act passed. Why is this happening? And this violence really helped to destroy the good feeling and hide-mindedness that the white community was giving it, and there was, in general, just sort of a lot of confusion about why is this happening. Now, that's what we want to look at. Why was this happening? Now, we've got to consider the African American communities. They're moving into northern and western cities, but the opportunities for employment that were there in World War II are not really there anymore. As white flight is occurring, as the white middle class is leaving for the suburbs, so is the business and the manufacturing. It's moving out as well, and it's leaving behind sort of an inner city ghetto. And there were policies by both the federal government and by private institutions and by private individuals that just made it easier for whites to move out and more difficult for blacks. And we get what is known as de facto segregation, or segregation just by practice and customs. Banks in whites' communities, they make it difficult to move into their communities. It's hard to get a loan. If you own in that community, you're white, you don't want to sell to a black or to a Jew. Or if it's a Protestant community, maybe not to a Catholic. And redlining is the practice of not giving houses and businesses loans in areas that are marked sort of on a map. And so we get the white flight, and a good example of one of these communities is Newark, New Jersey, which in 1940 was almost predominantly white, was a working class manufacturing city, not too far from New York City in New Jersey. But by 1967, the year of their riot, the African Americans are the majority in the community. And these neighborhoods, or the ghetto, there's no economic base, so there's no real good jobs. Outsides own much of it, the stores, the buildings, and they're not very good owners. And they're underrepresented, especially within the police force, but other areas, and they're underfunded, schools and public services. So underrepresentation, so, we see they're more than half the population, but there's very few, like bus drivers and police officers and clerks and tellers and whatnot. There's Harlem, another one of them. And so they become run down. As time progresses, they get more and more shoddier. When the pipes burst in the building, well, the owner's not going to do anything to fix it. It just sort of, the window's broken. Well, it's just going to be broken. And the police are predominantly white and are consistently abusive, especially towards young black men and boys. And so we see the causes. People in these communities are increasingly frustrated, angry, with feelings that they lack any kind of power, and they're people of desperation. And, one person has coined that the riot is the rhyme of the unheard. And this lack of opportunity, the poor housing, the lack of ownership, underrepresented, consistent discrimination and little acts of racism, and the consistent abuse of power by the police is going to explode. And much of the riots, what triggers it is police abuse, like a specific case of police killing or beating up a specific person, and just the community their frustration boils over. And when the riots occurred, a lot of people are saying, why is this happening? Well, there's others who understand the situation saying, yeah, why didn't it happen earlier? It would be the main concern. Now, what kind of form did the rioting take place? Well, there's looting and there's burning. And I'll get back to the looting in a moment. Now, the response is very heavy-handed, and this is, in particular, I'm thinking of Newark, New Jersey's riot. It was the most violent one. Local police, state police, National Guard are all brought in. There's very little training, especially the National Guard, who are just weekend warriors. It's something to do for fun on the weekends, a little camping in the summer, so it's not like a full-time soldiering position. And there's no communication between these three groups as well. And there was a view, they viewed the crowd, the mob, in a stereotype way, that this community is armed and dangerous, there are snipers everywhere, and they fire back quite a lot of ammunition. And it's recorded how much. They fired over 14,000 rounds of ammunition. We know this because each soldier is given a certain amount and they have to be held accountable. Okay, how many do you have now? And coming back the other way from the African American community, less than 100. So 14,000 shots to less than 100. A lot of random acts of violence, over 30 killed, and murder might be a better word. And it came to an end when, the governor just sort of, after a few days, calling on leaders in the community saying, what's going to bring this to an end? And they're just like, if you just leave, get your police out of here, get the soldiers out, and this will calm down very quickly. And it did. And at the end of it, as I said, with the looting, African Americans were not looting randomly. They were targeting specific stores, the stores that cheat them, the stores whose owner is white or Jewish and doesn't live in their community. Those stores and businesses that are locally owned, locally operated, were not targeted and were left alone. But at the end of the riot, the police burned down these stores. Now, at the same time that we have this urban rioting occurring, we have new voices like Malcolm X, who's not taking on the position of Martin Luther King, of using nonviolence. If you face violence, don't fight back. He will argue you should fight back. And the idea that we should build a community where whites and blacks live together, he's saying, no, I don't want to live with whites. I want to separate and take control of my own communities. And I'll give you one of his quotes. He was often accused of inciting violence, and he would argue otherwise. He'd say, this is his quote, "Concerning nonviolence, it is criminal to teach a man not to defend himself when he is the constant victim of brutal attacks. It is legal and lawful to own a shotgun or a rifle. We believe in obeying the law. The time has come for the American Negro to fight back in self-defense whenever and wherever he is being unjustly and unlawfully attacked." Now, whites view that as inciting violence. He views it as just logic. If you're attacked by the police or by a white mob, fight them back, is what he would urge. And we get more of a call for what would be called black power. This is James Meredith, who was the first African-American student at the University of Mississippi, and he had undergone a symbolic march to defy sort of fear and defy terrorism, and he is shot. Not killed, he's shot, could not continue the march. So the different organizations get together to continue the march themselves. And as they are marching, Martin Luther King is trying to break them into song of "We Shall Overcome." And others in the movement are changing the lyrics to "We Shall Overrun." And the one on the right there, Stokely Carmichael, starts to break away from the ideas of Martin Luther King. And he's in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He wants to stop recruiting whites within and develop African American pride. And you start to see divisions within these organizations of how to move forward. And one organization is created in this idea of black power, black control over their own neighborhoods. It's the Black Panthers, and they arm themselves and they vow to fight police brutality. And they also set up a lot of services within their communities, daycare, things like that. Now, they're also very radical, and they were handing out sort of leaflets of Mao Zedong. And this is a problem for the African American movement of how to avoid the label of communism. And, the FBI and J. Edgar Hoover, he's very much targeting leaders and trying to create a sense that they're getting support from the Soviet Union or that they themselves are communists. And there are members within the community who are sort of quite radical. And why not? They've gone through quite extreme, so they might be looking for extreme ideas. But the net effect is to really lose a lot of support within the broader community, both white and black. And then Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, and it's a symbolic end to the movement. And there's a number of rioting afterwards, the worst in U.S. history. And it sort of leads to thinking, okay, big picture and the legacy of the movement. Lyndon Baines Johnson, who very much wanted to end poverty in the United States, and he knew that that was intricately tied to de facto segregation and to racism in general, he commissioned a report which named Racism, Police Violence, the Lack of Opportunities, the Main Causes of the Rioting. And they urged, trying to end this de facto segregation, provide better housing opportunities for African Americans. But there's very reluctant to sort of implement these changes. There is not the political will in 1968 to move forward on these. And Lyndon Johnson will not run again, and Richard M. Nixon will come in, and he is not interested at all in sort of big government programs to end poverty. And then we look at the gains and just sort of what left unfinished. De jure segregation ended. The Jim Crow gone. And, over time, African Americans and whites in the Deep South will sort of learn to get along. There are more education, more jobs. There's more pride and more looking at their own history. There are the right to vote, political gains coming in. So some real gains. Unfinished, reduced white support for a movement. White flight and de facto segregation persists today. There's still unequal pay in employment. The stereotypes of the African Americans remains. And affirmative action programs to hire more blacks, even if they're less qualified, will be initiated. But then these are sort of seen as white racism. Reverse racism. And a lot of them do not survive the test of time. But just to end on a couple of graphs, this very much shows from 1959 to 1999 some major gains for African Americans. This first one here, persons living in poverty. Over half in 1959 live in poverty, whereas about 1/5 in 1999. Real, substantial, absolute improvement. Same for whites, coming down as well. And then college education, only 3% getting a college education in 1959, and about 1 in 5 in 1999. Now, both poverty and education levels are less than whites, but we can see some real gains in both of them. But where I see a major setback for the African American community is with the war on drugs, which was initiated by Richard Nixon and really applied and enforced by Ronald Reagan. And this shows the number of Americans in prison. And 1980, that steep rise as the war on drug gets real. And Richard M. Nixon, when he initiated the program, he sort of understood that you can use this to go after your political enemies. And a lot of the white, younger, liberal activists would be tied with marijuana, and in the 1970s there was a serious problem with heroin amongst African Americans, and in the 1980s a problem with crack cocaine, and it was used to incarcerate. That was the strategy to deal with them, is to throw them into prison. Now this is showing not by race, but if we look at the breakdown by race, and this is showing in 2006, and we can see African Americans predominantly in prison, and it's a major problem today. All right, so that's the civil rights movement. We're going to end it there. Thank you very much for listening.